So a lot of people have said, hey, man, what is this NLP stuff?
Mhm.
We have a coach. I love him. That's Coach Burt. He's from Tennessee. And he's always, hey, man, what's this NLP stuff? You got to tell me about this NLP stuff. Like, that's my best Tennessee accent. So NLP stands for Neuro-Linguistics Programming. And what that means is, so we'll break this down. It's an acronym. So the N is neural, and that has to do with the neurology of the brain. So the circuits and all that stuff. And we won't get into the bioscience or the neuroscience of it, but it has to do with the neurology. So it turns out that all the thoughts we have, the emotions, they actually have a neuron connection inside of our brains. So whenever we have a thought, our brains will just kind of mold. It'll make connections from neurons to axons or dendrites. I try not to get into the weeds here, but they'll make connections between the two neurons, and they'll make another connection, and that will represent a thought or an emotion, for instance. The linguistic is basically language patterns that we use. So this is our conscious use of language. Earlier, I said, oh, that was great use of language. Yeah, see, right? Because it turns out language is really important to not only like influencing ourselves, but influencing others. And we'll learn a little bit more about language patterns as the event goes on. And then P is for programming, and that has to do with the internal belief systems, values that we all walk around with that we learn from a young age. So that's in a nutshell. NLP is a model for success. It was started by John Grinder and Richard Bandler back in the 70s. And what they did was they studied successful people, psychiatrists, physicists, like a lot of different people that had achieved success. And they made a model for how someone can make success. An example of that is if you're a basketball player and you want to get good at being a basketball player, you model after them. For instance, when I was a kid, I grew up during the days of Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson. So I would just model after them. They would go up to the free throw line, dribble the ball 3 times, shoot. So then that's what I did. I would go to the free throw line, dribble 3 times, and shoot. So it turns out that success leaves clues.
Mm.
So if you're ever seeking to become successful at something, you want to find someone that's doing it very well and at a successful level, and then just copy them. And copy, quote unquote, is the same thing as modeling them. NLP has what we call a communication model. And it's basically a model for how the brain is organized. And so we're going to use that here to gain a better understanding of how the mind works using this model. So this is your brain here. And we want to start with kind of outside of our body. So as you all know, that there's a lot of things going on. We have cell phones, we got TikTok and Facebook and Instagram. And I'm sure you're like me, every 5 minutes or so, there's a ding going off on our phones. And so we're living in a world where we're surrounded by information. It turns out that it's about 2 million bits of information that we're receiving through our 5 senses every single second.
Say that again.
It's 2 million bits of information. These are text message notifications. These are just the light that's bouncing off our eyeballs, people talking to us, the sense that we have on our fingers. 2 million bits of information coming into our brains, into our senses every single second. So you can imagine that the brain has to figure out a way to filter all that information down, because it turns out that we can only process about 128 bits of information at any given time.
Say that again.
128 bits of information the brain actually can process at any given time.
Wow.
So it takes from 2 million bits of information and just funnels that down into 128 bits. And so if you see the model here in the diagram, you have where there's an external event, whether that means it's a situation that you're part of, or either air condition kicked on and you can now feel the cold air on your skin. There's millions of events that happen every single second. And then all that information comes in, 2 million bits of information. It then goes through filters, and these filters are going to do one of 3 things for the most part. So the first one is the information is going to be generalized. And so this is where global conclusions are based off of just one particular experience. Now, this is a great way to learn things, but oftentimes what happens, this generalization, it creates a situation where they're part of an event that's not necessarily resourceful for them, and then they make a global decision about it. So, for instance, if they're at a job and they get laid off, then they make the generalization that all jobs are going to lay me off or something like that, right? So they take a situation and they generalize it for all cases. But the brain has to say, "Hey, I need to be able to say these situations are this and these situations are this in order to cut down on all the data." The next filter is going to be distortion. And so as the information comes in, we shift the meaning, the experience that we're having based on the sensory data. And so we misrepresent it. And so we have misrepresentations of our actual reality. So earlier we were talking about the comfort zone,
Mhm.
right? And how the brain is trying to protect us. So can you imagine like being in a situation where someone is stuck, someone is quote unquote stuck. And so they're living their life and they're like, I'm never going to get ahead. Like it's always going to be this way. Regardless of all the opportunities that are out there, their mind is distorting reality to support this narrative because their mind wants to keep it efficient and keep them
Mm.
safe. And so this is where distortion, where two people can look at the same event, the same circumstances, without getting into politics and all that stuff. There's a group of individuals that are looking at the world going, this is the greatest opportunity since sliced bread. And another group of people are screaming because the sky is falling, right?
Can we
There's,
also say maybe over the last couple of years we've seen a couple of examples of this?
yeah, I'm sure there's been a few. Yeah, so this is what we would call a distortion. Information is being distorted as it comes into being broken down. These 2 million bits of information being distorted in order to meet some narrative. So lastly, we have deletion. So there's a deletion filter that, you know what, the one that I think a lot of people, why are you smiling?
Because it's gonna be good stuff.
Yes. So yes, he knows because we have conversations often. And I feel like she deletes a lot of the things that I say. I think they call it like selective hearing is I think the term for it. But
Not perfect, guys.
so it's interesting because you can hear deletion in people's language.
Mm.
They'll say, it's over there. What is it? I don't know what it is. Like it, I think is probably one of the biggest deletions that people use.
I'm like, you don't know what it is?
Yeah. I'm
You
like,
can't read my brain?
no, not at all.
Mm.
So you can see how these filters shape our reality, whether it's generalization or it's distorting the data or deleting the data. This is ultimately what keeps people stuck because they're filtering all the information around them down to the narrative that's deep down inside. And
That's
we're
the
yeah, the right. So when we talk about limitations and stuff, that's the programming that's keeping people stuck. So it's not your fault, it's your programming. So far we've been talking about how we've been using the word brain interchangeably with mind. So we want to focus more. So we want to get away from talking about the brain because that's going to encompass terminology like neurons and dendrites and axons and stuff like that. I would love to talk to you guys about that if you want.
That's
I
gonna be
can.
another training.
Okay. I'll do that another time. So the mind, so when we think about the mind, it's more of a conceptual model and it's composed of primarily two parts. There's more, but we're going to talk about the conscious mind. That's the part that's outside, counting the leaves outside that we gave a task to when we first started. And then there's a subconscious mind. So the conscious mind, it represents about 10% of all our daily activities. So right now, there's a part of your mind that's consciously listening to my voice, is consciously seeing, it's writing notes. It's also making meaning of the things that I'm saying. It's trying to find understanding and put connections together between the words that it's hearing. And so that represent about 10% of what we do on a day-to-day basis is only conscious. The larger portion of what we do, our activities, is subconscious, meaning that we're not consciously aware of it. So these are things like our memory is stored in our subconscious mind, the functions around emotions and feelings, the habits that we have. Just think about, since you've been here, your heart has probably beat, I would say, tens of thousands of times, I hope. And you didn't consciously have to tell your heart to beat, because there's a part in your mind that is just, it has a program that runs that keeps the heart beating. And there's programs in your mind that, if, like, for instance, if you're driving down the freeway, and how many of you have been in that situation where you're driving down the freeway and then you zone out because you're being hypnotized?
You missed the wrong turn.
Yeah. And then someone like taps on the brake and you go, oh, I'm driving. Because your subconscious mind is continually listening, continually scanning, continually keep an eye out to keep you protected and efficient. And it turns out, so 90% of everything we do is subconscious. When we're interacting with people, we're interacting with their subconscious mind. Think about times that you're at work or you're dealing with your spouse, you're dealing with their unconscious programming that they may not even be aware that they're doing. How many of you have heard, I didn't say that? And you're like, you just said that. I just heard you say that. And they're like, I didn't say that, because it just came, like, their subconscious programming just came out. They're not consciously aware of it. And then they switch in and they come back to you and they're like, oh no, I never said that. And so it's a really
I'm sure it's
interesting
caused
thing.
some critical conversations, right?
Yes, some very critical conversations. So one, just be mindful that when you're dealing with people and when you're dealing with yourself, it's just programming or programs that run all day. So I love this stuff because I shared with you that I'm an ex software engineer. And so from a program standpoint, I know that I would create programs that do XYZ, and I was expecting a result, and I would program the computer to get that result. And so now that I'm working with individuals on helping them shift their programming, we started the result, and then we just figure out what program is needed to install to get that result.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a completely different shift on the way I look at people now, because we're not like this complicated thing. If we look at it in terms of, oh, this is my problem, I write a program and boom, now I get the result that I want.